Hello and welcome to this first video about making our COVID Cleaner game. In this video, we will just start by putting all our backgrounds and our game objects into our scene, and we might get into doing a little bit of scripting with the virus. So first off, you will have the images given to you, and you can simply bring them into Unity like I've done here, and drag the background in. I'm going to put that background in, and as you can see, it's quite a bit bigger than the camera. Now this might not be a bad idea because it will give us more of a playroom. So I'm just going to leave it a bit like that at the moment. But I'm going to make sure I rename this, and just a simple name, just what it is, the background. Let's drag in one of our, I guess our virus killer here. I'm just going to put it into our scene somewhere there. So there it is. And again, just give it its name. Actually, virus killer is probably perfect, or, you know, we could rename it, but I think that's a pretty good name there. And then our virus as well, I'm going to drag in. And as you can see, this is quite a bit bigger. And so I am going to reduce the scale here. Something like this, you know, I would play around with the value. That might not be too bad. Just scale it uniformly there, about 1/10 of the size that it originally was. Now, in terms of the positions, we're probably okay there. We've got them in there. I might just sort of rename this one SARS-CoV. I'll just call it COVID. Okay. So we've got to start. Okay, these are not perfect yet, but you know, we've got to start here. We can quickly and easily change the sizes as we need to. Now, what I would probably start off with here is just adding a little bit of more information to say our player here, our virus killer, and also to our COVID virus here. One of the things is when they've come in, we've got our transform, we've got the renderer, which shows up the object. But for our player here, our virus killer, what I want to make sure that I do is add a rigid body. And that will give us the physics, okay? Now, just to show you what happens if I hit play, because it's kind of built for a platformer, once I've added that, you'll notice that the virus falls. Doesn't make sense in this game, so we just simply come into this, and under here there's gravity scale, and I would just set that to 0. So once I've done that, then the player, right, will not fall anymore, because it's not reacting to gravity. Good. The other thing that it needs is a collider. So if I sort of zoom in on this, you'll notice that there's no, you know, there's nothing sort of surrounding it here. If I turn off the sprite renderer, right, there's just nothing there. There's a bounding box, but nothing there. It would not detect any collisions. So I'm just going to add a, probably a circle collider, okay, and making sure we're in 2D, right? And then I can just take a look at that and see if that's good or bad. Personally, that's a little bit too big for me. Probably the easiest thing to do here is just to come into the radius, and you can see how my cursor changed to these arrows, and I can just drag it in or drag it out. Personally, I would probably bring it in a little bit beyond those spikes, make sure it's roughly centered. It is there. You could also change the center if you needed to. Just shift it over a little bit there, maybe. Yeah. Later on, if it seems not quite right, you can always modify these things. We're just trying to set up the basic part of the game here. That's good for this guy. Let's just go over to our virus. There we are. This one, we're not going to really need physics, at least in my part of the game here. So I'm going to just add a component, and also I'm just going to add that circle collider. So just to show you here, if I clear this away, I can find a bunch of components that I can add. If you go under Physics 2D, you will find the Circle Collider. And again, I would just zoom in on that. Make sure it's reasonable. Again, I might feel like pulling that radius in just a touch. Something like that. And yeah, we're basically done. So our scene here, if I just sort of zoom out again, is we've got a virus, and we've got our player, and then we've got our scene. Okay, let's try to get this player moving so that we can actually do something to it. So I'm just going to click on virus killer again. And actually, sorry, before I do that, I'm going to come back up to the assets, and you can see that we had our images that you've hopefully dragged in, and our scene. You might have a good, it might be a good idea just to save the scene at the moment. As you sort of make progress, saving it is a good idea just in case anything happens. Right-click in your assets folder, and I'm just going to create a folder first, and I am going to create a scripts folder. This will hold all the scripts that we're going to write. I'm going to double-click in that, and then I'm going to right-click in here, create C# script. Now this is a very important point here. We don't want to open up our script till we've changed the name. And so I'm just going to call this movement. Click on that. And one thing that we need to double check is that, just before I sort of go and open that script up, that under your preferences, under your external tools, that you've got Visual Studio selected. We'll be using Visual Studio to edit our scripts. Double click on movement. Take a second here to open up. And once it's opened, we will start scripting. So one thing to double check in case you renamed it, notice this is movement here, .cs, so C# script. This name here has to match up. Many students will rename their scripts and not change this name. That causes a problem. So just make sure those two are the same. All right, we're going to start off here by doing a couple little things. One is we're first going to grab the physics part, the rigid body, by creating a reference to it. This lets us manipulate or change the physics. So that's our first sort of goal here, is to get this thing to move. So what I'm going to do is put a rigid body 2D. Now hopefully your program is, Visual Studio here is suggesting for you. If it is not, go back and double check your preferences there. And I'm just going to call it RB. We'll put a 2D there too. Okay. So that's them right there. What we need to do then is once the game starts, so notice we're in the start function, we need to put this so that RB2D is set to, so that equal sign is basically the set, to grabbing a component, and we're going to grab that rigid body 2D, and we have to put open and closing braces there just to make sure that the statement runs. So, and then that semicolon to end the statement. So what it's going to do, and we'll see this in a second here, is that it's going to grab that rigid body. In fact, just to make it very clear, I'm going to call this serialized, whoops, if I can spell it, and if I had left a space, it would help me, serialized field. Let me just leave a space here, and it will all do it nicely. Sorry. Try again here, just to show you. So square bracket, there we are, serialized field, perfect. And I'll just square that. That will just make it visible for us in the when we're in Unity. And let's just sort of see that happen. So I'm going to press Control S to save it. You always have to save before you go back to Unity if you want to see your changes to your script. And give it a second here. Click on your virus killer. What you'll want to do is add your component. So I just scrolled down in the inspector here, and grabbing this, I can add that component there. What you'll notice is that RB2D shows up and it says none. Once I hit play, it finds that component. It gets the component and puts it in here. Good. So now we can do stuff with that. Before we do that though, we need to create a couple variables to take the input from the keyboard. And we're going to be doing that in the update, but more specifically, we're going to change this to fixed update. And I'll explain to you in class why we're doing this. We'll just sort of keep the video clean here. I'm going to create two variables. One's going to be called the move horizontal. And we're going to set that to input. So I can follow along here, dot get axis. And this one, we're going to take the horizontal controller here. So we'll talk about that in a second. And I'm going to do the same thing. Oops, and what I forgot here is that this needs to be a float. Float is a decimal number. Do the same thing for the vertical. Make sure you spell horizontal and vertical correctly and with the capital. And just before we sort of do that, go back to Unity and make sure this is working. We're just going to do one more thing here, and we'll end this video here. Before we get it moving, I'm going to create a vector 2. So a two-dimensional vector, and we're going to call this movement, and we're going to set it to a new vector 2. So it's just sort of updating its value here based on the information. And vector 2, two-dimensional, so the x and the y. And one of the x value is going to be our move horizontal, and then our y value, so it's just like a coordinate point here, move vertical. There we go. And put a semicolon in there. Now we're going to be able to view this in Unity in a second, and I'm going to do that by doing a debug.log. Debug.logs are very useful for sort of seeing what's happening behind the scenes. And so I'm going to see what my movement values are. Perfect. Okay. One thing great about Visual Studio is if you're seeing any red or any problems, go and look at it and make sure your code's right. I don't see any red. I think we're pretty good. I'm going to hit save here, Control S, and I'm going to go back into Unity. Now we haven't added any forces yet. We'll do that in the next video. What I'm looking for here is making sure when I hit play that I'm going to get something in the console down here. And this is the console down here. I'm going to click on it and it brings up my little console window. You can kind of see it working, these numbers getting bigger. What is happening is that it's checking and then printing out the value of the movement. At the moment it's 0 and 0. That's because I'm not pressing any keys on the keyboard. If I make sure I click in my game window here, and if I use the left the left arrow, it shows -1. Let it go, 0. Right, it's +1. I press the up button, it gives me +1. And if I press the down arrow, it gives me -1. Notice that they're in different values. It's the x, so this horizontal is sort of the x value, and then y is that second value, and that's the up and down. So that gives you an idea of how we're going to take the input and use that to make our object move. Now, one other thing I'll mention here is that input came from, I think, project settings here. There is the input manager. There are preset axes. And there's horizontal and there's vertical. I'm just going to show horizontal here. And if I go into horizontal, I can see that I've got the left and right arrows, negative and positive, or the A and D keys as well. These settings here give it a little bit more weight, so it's not just purely on and off. It kind of resembles a bit more of an analog stick. Well, that's good for now. We will come back and get our virus killer moving.